The sun was setting on Highway 75, casting long shadows across the road. Officer Blake Thompson had been patrolling this stretch for over 6 years, and today felt different. His radio crackled with reports of break-ins and domestic disputes all afternoon. The stress was getting to him, just like it had been for weeks now. That's when he saw the black pickup truck speeding past him at what looked like 80 miles per hour in a 65 zone. Blake hit his lights and pulled out behind the vehicle. The truck took a moment to slow down, which always made officers nervous. Finally, it pulled over to the shoulder. Blake ran the license plate through his system as he sat in his patrol car for a moment. Clean record, no warrants, just a regular traffic stop, or so he thought. He grabbed his citation book and stepped out of his vehicle, walking toward the truck with the confident stride that came from years of experience. Inside the pickup truck, Sergeant Kevin Martinez was having the best day he'd had in months. After 18 long months overseas, he was finally heading home to surprise his family. His wife thought he wouldn't be back for another week, and his 2 kids had no idea Daddy was coming home today. The thought of seeing their faces when he walked through the front door made him smile, even as he realized he'd been speeding. Kevin had been driving for 12 hours straight, stopping only for gas and coffee. His military uniform was wrinkled from the long journey, but he wore it with pride. The patches on his chest told the story of his service. 3 tours overseas, countless missions, and decorations that represented sacrifices most people would never understand. When he saw the police lights in his rearview mirror, Kevin's heart sank a little. Not because he was afraid, but because it meant he'd be delayed getting home. Still, he knew he deserved the ticket. He'd been lost in thoughts of home and hadn't been paying attention to his speed. Kevin pulled over carefully, making sure to get completely off the road. Safety was always his priority, whether in a war zone or on an American highway. He put the truck in park, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where the officer could see them. This was basic procedure that had been drilled into him during his military training. Officer Thompson approached the vehicle, noting that the driver appeared to be alone. The windows were tinted, making it hard to see inside clearly. Blake tapped on the driver's side window and waited for it to roll down. "Good evening, sir," Blake said in his professional voice. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" Kevin rolled down his window and looked up at the officer. "Yes, sir. I was speeding. I'm sorry about that. I've been driving for a long time, and I guess I wasn't paying attention to my speed." The honesty caught Blake off guard for a moment. Most people tried to make excuses or claim they didn't know they were speeding. This guy was being straight with him from the start. That was usually a good sign. "I clocked you at 79 and a 65, Blake said, pulling out his citation book. "I'm going to need to see your license, registration, and insurance, please." Kevin reached slowly toward his glove compartment, making sure his movements were deliberate and visible. "My registration and insurance are in here," he said, opening the compartment carefully. "My license is in my wallet." As Kevin handed over his documents, Blake noticed something different about this driver. There was a certain discipline in the way he moved, a respect for authority that you didn't see in everyone. The man's uniform was also starting to become visible as he shifted in his seat. Blake took the documents back to his patrol car to run the license. "Kevin Martinez, 32 years old, clean driving record." As Blake was processing the information, he noticed movement in the truck. Kevin had stepped out of his vehicle and was standing beside it. This immediately put Blake on alert. Standard procedure was for drivers to remain in their vehicles unless asked to step out. Why was this guy getting out of his truck? Blake's hand instinctively moved closer to his radio. "Sir, I need you to get back in your vehicle," Blake called out as he approached. Kevin heard the command and stopped moving. "Sorry, officer. I've been sitting for 12 hours straight. My legs are cramping up. I just needed to stretch for a second." Blake could see the man more clearly now. He was wearing what looked like military fatigues, though Blake didn't immediately register what that meant. The uniform was rumpled from travel, and Kevin's combat boots were dusty from his journey. "I understand, sir, but I need you to get back in your vehicle for both of our safety," Blake said, his voice carrying more authority now. Kevin nodded and started to move back toward his truck, but his movements were slow and careful. After months of being in dangerous situations overseas, Kevin had developed habits that kept him alive. He moved deliberately, kept his hands visible, and never made sudden movements. These habits had saved his life more than once in combat zones. But Officer Thompson didn't understand this context. To him, Kevin's careful movements looked suspicious. Why was this guy moving so slowly? Why wasn't he just getting back in his truck like any normal person would? "Sir, I need you to move faster," Blake said, his patience starting to wear thin. Kevin tried to comply, but years of military training had programmed him to move with caution and awareness. Plus, his body was exhausted from the long drive and months of deployment. His movements remained measured and deliberate. The situation was starting to feel tense, though neither man fully understood why. Blake was interpreting Kevin's caution as potential defiance or preparation for something bad. Kevin was simply trying to follow orders while dealing with his own fatigue and the ingrained habits that had kept him alive overseas. Blake's stress from the long day was beginning to show. He'd dealt with 3 difficult calls already, including one where a suspect had tried to run. His nerves were frayed and his judgment was starting to be affected by exhaustion and accumulated stress. Kevin finally reached his truck door, but before he could get back inside, Blake called out again, "Actually, sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." Kevin stopped and turned around, confusion clear on his face. "Is everything okay, officer? I was just trying to get back in my truck like you asked." The confusion in Kevin's voice sounded like attitude to Blake's stressed ears. This day had been too long with too many difficult encounters. Blake's training told him to control the situation, but his exhausted mind was starting to see threats that weren't really there. Kevin stood by his truck, hands visible, wondering what he had done wrong. He was tired. He wanted to get home to his family, and now this simple traffic stop was turning into something else entirely. He tried to remain calm and respectful, the way his military training had taught him to interact with authority figures. Neither man realized it, but they were about to experience a moment that would change both of their lives forever. What started as a routine traffic stop was becoming something much more serious, and the peaceful evening was about to be shattered by misunderstanding, stress, and poor judgment. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Thompson stood about 10 feet away from Kevin, his hand resting on his duty belt. Something about this whole situation felt off to him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. Kevin remained standing by his truck, hands clearly visible at his sides. He was trying his best to understand what was happening. In his mind, this should have been a simple speeding ticket. Write the citation, take the lecture about driving safely, and be on his way home. Instead, he found himself standing on the side of the highway being treated like a suspect. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands on the hood of your vehicle," Officer Thompson said, his voice now carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. Kevin's heart started beating faster. This wasn't normal procedure for a traffic stop, at least not from what he knew. He'd been pulled over twice before in his life, both times for minor infractions, and neither time had involved anything like this. "Officer, can I ask what's wrong?" I admitted I was speeding. "I'm happy to take the ticket. I just want to get home to my family," Kevin said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. But Blake was beyond listening to reason at this point. His day had been filled with uncooperative people, and his stress levels were through the roof. Every fiber of his being was telling him that this situation was dangerous, even though there was no real evidence to support that feeling. "I'm not going to ask you again, sir. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle now," Blake said, his voice rising slightly. Kevin felt his chest tighten. This was bringing back memories he'd rather forget. The authoritative commands, the feeling of being under suspicion, the way his heart was racing. It all reminded him of moments during his deployment when danger was everywhere. His body was starting to react the way it had been trained to react in combat situations, but this wasn't a combat zone. This was supposed to be home. This was supposed to be safe. Kevin slowly turned around and placed his hands on the hood of his truck. The metal was still warm from the engine, and he could feel the heat through his palms. His military uniform was now fully visible to Officer Thompson, though Blake still wasn't registering what he was seeing. "I'm a soldier." "Officer," Kevin said quietly, hoping this information might help diffuse the situation. "I just got back from overseas. I'm trying to get home to surprise my family." Blake heard the words, but they didn't really sink in. His mind was focused on what he perceived as a potentially dangerous situation. He'd been taught that people would say anything to get out of trouble, And right now, all he could think about was maintaining control. "Keep your mouth shut and don't move," Blake ordered as he approached Kevin from behind. The harshness in the officer's voice sent a chill down Kevin's spine. This wasn't how police officers were supposed to treat people, especially people who were cooperating. Kevin had always respected law enforcement. During his time overseas, he'd worked alongside military police and had nothing but appreciation for the difficult job they did. Blake began to pat down Kevin's uniform, searching for weapons or contraband. As his hands moved over Kevin's pockets, he felt something that made him even more suspicious. "What's in your pocket?" Blake demanded. "Just my phone and my wallet, sir," Kevin replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Blake pulled out Kevin's phone and wallet, setting them on the hood of the truck. As he did, several items fell out of the wallet: military ID cards, a photo of Kevin with his unit, and a small card that Blake didn't take time to examine closely. The pat-down continued, and Blake found nothing threatening. No weapons, no drugs, nothing that would justify his heightened level of suspicion. But instead of calming down, Blake seemed to become more agitated. The lack of evidence wasn't reassuring him. It was making him feel like he was missing something. Kevin stood perfectly still during the search, but inside his mind was racing. The way the officer was handling him, the aggressive tone, the unnecessary roughness, it was all triggering memories from his time in combat zones. His breathing was becoming shallow and he was starting to feel dizzy. This was a panic attack starting to build, though Kevin didn't recognize it for what it was. He'd never experienced anything like this before. During his deployment, he'd been the steady one, the soldier others looked to for calm leadership. But this situation was different. This felt personal and unjust in a way that combat never had. "Officer, please," Kevin said, his voice starting to shake slightly. "I don't understand what's happening. I was just speeding. I admitted it. Can you please just write me the ticket so I can go home?" Blake interpreted the shakiness in Kevin's voice as nervousness that suggested guilt. In his stressed and exhausted state, he was reading everything as confirmation of his suspicions, even though those suspicions were based on nothing concrete. "You seem pretty nervous for someone who just got a simple traffic stop," Blake said accusingly. "I'm nervous because you're treating me like a criminal when I haven't done anything wrong," Kevin replied, his frustration finally starting to show through. That frustration was exactly what Blake was waiting to hear. In his mind, it confirmed that this person was being uncooperative and potentially dangerous. Blake's training kicked in, but not the good parts of his training, the parts that emphasized de-escalation and community policing. Instead, the stress and exhaustion brought out the worst aspects of his conditioning. "Turn around and face me," Blake ordered. Kevin complied, turning to face the officer. For the first time, Blake got a clear look at Kevin's uniform and the patches on his chest. There were military insignia, unit patches and ribbons that indicated overseas service, but Blake's mind wasn't processing this information correctly. He was too focused on what he saw as a threatening situation. Kevin looked directly at Officer Thompson, and Blake could see something in the soldier's eyes that he misinterpreted completely. Kevin's eyes showed confusion, frustration, and the beginning of panic. But Blake saw what he thought was defiance and potential aggression. "You think you're tough because you wear that uniform?" Blake said, his voice dripping with an anger that had been building all day. The words hit Kevin like a physical blow. This man was disrespecting not just him, but his service and his uniform. Kevin had spent months putting his life on the line for his country, and now he was being treated like this by the very people he'd sworn to protect. "I've never claimed to be tough." "Officer," Kevin replied, his military training helping him maintain some level of composure, "I just want to go home to my family." But Blake was beyond reasoning. The mention of family sounded like manipulation to him. His judgment was completely clouded by stress, exhaustion, and perhaps some deeper issues that he'd never addressed. "Everyone's got a sob story," Blake said dismissively. "Get back up against the vehicle." As Kevin turned back around to face the truck, his hands began to shake slightly. The combination of exhaustion from his long journey, the stress of the confrontation, and the triggering of memories from his deployment was creating a perfect storm in his nervous system. Blake saw the shaking and interpreted it as Kevin preparing to do something. In reality, Kevin was fighting off a panic attack and trying desperately to maintain his composure. But in Blake's stressed mind, every sign of Kevin's distress looked like a threat. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, and neither man fully understood how they'd gotten to this point. What should have been a 5-minute traffic stop was turning into something that would haunt both of them forever. The sound of sirens filled the air as backup units responded to what dispatch had called a disturbance during a traffic stop. Officer Linda Rodriguez was the first to arrive on scene, pulling up just as Blake was standing over Kevin, who remained motionless on the ground. Linda had been a police officer for 15 years, and she'd seen plenty of situations go bad. But something about this scene immediately struck her as wrong. The man on the ground wasn't fighting, wasn't yelling, wasn't even moving much. He was just lying there, blood visible on his face, wearing what looked like a military uniform. "Blake, what's the situation?" Linda called out as she approached, her hand instinctively resting on her radio. Blake turned toward her, and Linda could see something in his eyes that concerned her. He looked almost panicked, like someone who was starting to realize they'd made a terrible mistake but wasn't ready to admit it yet. "Subject was non-compliant during a traffic stop," Blake said, using the official language that cops use to describe these situations. "Had to use force to control the situation." Linda looked down at Kevin, who was now slowly trying to sit up. As her eyes focused on his uniform, she began to make out details that Blake had somehow missed. The patches, the ribbons, the insignia. This wasn't just someone wearing military-style clothing. This was clearly an actual soldier. "Blake," Linda said carefully, "this man is in military uniform." Blake looked down at Kevin as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The adrenaline was starting to wear off and his vision was becoming less tunnel-focused. Kevin's uniform was indeed clearly military, complete with name tape, unit patches, and service ribbons. Kevin finally managed to sit up, wincing from the pain in his head and the residual effects of being tased. He looked up at Officer Rodriguez with eyes that showed confusion, hurt, and something else, a sadness that ran deeper than physical pain. "Ma'am," Kevin said softly to Linda, "I'm Sergeant Kevin Martinez, United States Army. I just got back from overseas. I was pulled over for speeding and I don't understand what happened." Linda felt her stomach drop. Not only was this man clearly a soldier, but he was speaking with the kind of respect and composure that suggested he posed no threat whatsoever. She'd dealt with genuinely dangerous people before, and this wasn't one of them. "Are you injured, Sergeant?" Linda asked, crouching down to Kevin's level. Kevin touched the cut on his forehead gingerly. "I think I have a concussion. My head hit the pavement pretty hard, and my shoulder feels like it might be dislocated." Linda stood up and walked over to where Kevin's wallet contents were scattered on the ground. What she saw there made her feel sick to her stomach. Military ID cards, photos of Kevin with his fellow soldiers, and something that made her gasp audibly. It was an official military commendation card for the Bronze Star Medal, along with a Purple Heart card indicating Kevin had been wounded in action. Linda had a brother who had served in Iraq, and she knew exactly what these decorations meant. This wasn't just a soldier, this was a decorated war hero. "Blake," Linda said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "come here and look at this." Blake approached reluctantly, as if he already knew what he was going to see wouldn't be good. Linda held up the Bronze Star card so he could read it clearly. "This man is a Bronze Star recipient," Linda said. "Do you know what you have to do to earn a Bronze Star, Blake?" Blake stared at the card, the words seeming to blur together as the full magnitude of what he had done began to hit him. The Bronze Star was awarded for heroic achievement in combat operations. His own father had earned one in Vietnam, and Blake had grown up hearing stories about the bravery required to receive such an honor. Kevin was now leaning against the rear of his truck, still trying to process what had happened to him. "Officer Rodriguez," he said quietly, "can I please call my wife? She's been trying to reach me and she's going to be worried." The simple request broke Linda's heart. Here was a man who had just been brutally attacked by a police officer, and his primary concern was reassuring his worried wife. She walked over to Kevin and handed him his phone, which had been buzzing periodically with missed calls and text messages. As Kevin dialed his wife's number, Linda pulled Blake aside for a private conversation. "What the hell happened here, Blake?" she demanded in a low voice. Blake looked like a man who was in shock. He was acting suspicious. He wouldn't follow commands properly. He kept moving slowly like he was planning something." Planning something, Linda said incredulously. Blake, look at him. Really look at him. Does that look like someone who was planning to hurt you? Blake looked over at Kevin, who was now talking softly to his wife on the phone, trying to explain that he was okay but would be a little late getting home. Kevin's voice was gentle and reassuring even though he was clearly in pain and distress. Honey, I'm fine, Kevin was saying. There was just a little mix-up during a traffic stop. No, don't worry. I'll be home soon. Give the kids a hug for me. Linda listened to Kevin's conversation and felt a wave of shame on behalf of her profession. This man was protecting his family from worry even after being attacked for no reason. He was showing more grace and maturity than the police officer who had assaulted him. Meanwhile, more backup units were arriving, along with paramedics who had been called to the scene. Officer James Wright, a veteran cop with 25 years of experience, got out of his patrol car and immediately assessed the situation. James took one look at Kevin, sitting against his truck, bleeding from his head, uniform torn and dirty, and then looked at Blake, who appeared to be having some kind of breakdown. Someone want to tell me what happened here? James asked. Linda filled him in on what she had discovered about Kevin's military service and decorations. As she spoke, James's expression grew increasingly grave. He walked over to where Kevin's military documents were still scattered on the ground and examined them himself. Jesus Christ, James muttered under his breath as he looked at Kevin's service record. 3 combat tours, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Blake, do you have any idea what you've done? Blake was starting to hyperventilate. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had attacked a decorated war hero, someone who had risked his life for his country, someone who represented everything that was supposed to be good about America. The paramedics were now examining Kevin, checking his head wound and assessing whether he needed to go to the hospital. Kevin was answering their questions politely and cooperatively, just as he had been cooperative throughout the entire traffic stop. Sir, we really think you should go to the hospital to get that head injury checked out, one of the paramedics said. Kevin looked up at the paramedic with tired eyes. Will it take long? I just want to go home to my family. I've been away for 18 months and they're not expecting me until next week. I wanted to surprise them. The simple humanity of Kevin's words hit everyone present like a physical blow. Here was a man who had served his country with honor, who had been brutally attacked for no reason, and whose only concern was getting home to surprise his family. Linda looked at Blake, who was now sitting in his patrol car with his head in his hands. She felt a mixture of anger, disgust, and professional embarrassment. This incident would reflect poorly on all of them, on their entire department, and on law enforcement in general. But more than that, she felt heartbroken for Kevin. His homecoming, which should have been one of the happiest days of his life, had been ruined by the inexcusable actions of a fellow officer. The joy of surprising his family had been replaced by trauma and confusion. As the paramedics prepared to transport Kevin to the hospital for evaluation, Linda walked over to him one more time. Sergeant Martinez, she said formally, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for what happened here today. This should never have occurred, and we will make sure it's investigated thoroughly. Kevin looked up at her with eyes that held no anger, only sadness. Thank you, officer. I just want to understand why this happened. I've never been treated like this in my own country. I've risked my life overseas to protect people's freedoms, and I've never felt as unsafe as I did here tonight. Those words would haunt everyone present for a long time to come. A decorated war hero, attacked on American soil by the very people sworn to protect and serve. It was a betrayal of everything law enforcement was supposed to represent. The moment that would change everything happened faster than either man could have predicted. Kevin was standing with his hands on his truck, trying to control his breathing and understand why this traffic stop had gone so wrong. Officer Thompson was behind him, radiating tension and suspicion that had no basis in reality. Kevin made a mistake that would cost him dearly. His phone, which Officer Thompson had placed on the hood of the truck, started buzzing with an incoming call. Without thinking, Kevin glanced toward the sound. It was an automatic reaction, the kind of small movement that anyone might make when they hear their phone ringing. But Blake saw that slight turn of Kevin's head as something entirely different. In his stressed and paranoid state, he interpreted it as Kevin preparing to make a move. Every warning bell in Blake's mind went off at once, even though there was no real threat. "Don't move," Blake shouted, but Kevin had already started to turn his head back to face forward. The phone continued to buzz, and Kevin could see from the corner of his eye that it was his wife calling. She was probably wondering where he was. Maybe she was calling to tell him about her day, or to ask when he'd be home. The thought of his family made Kevin's heart ache with longing, but also filled him with a desperate need to get out of this situation. "That's my wife calling," Kevin said softly, not turning around. "She doesn't know I'm coming home today. She's probably worried because I usually call by now." Blake heard the words, but in his altered state of mind, they sounded like an excuse or a distraction. He was convinced that Kevin was planning something, and the mention of a wife seemed like an attempt to manipulate him emotionally. "I said don't move and keep your mouth shut," Blake said, his voice now filled with an anger that had been building all day. Kevin felt his patience finally starting to crack. He'd been respectful, he'd been cooperative, and he'd done everything the officer had asked. Yet he was being treated like a dangerous criminal for no reason he could understand. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. "Sir, with all due respect, I haven't done anything wrong except speed," Kevin said, his voice carrying the first hint of frustration he'd allowed himself to show. "I've been polite and cooperative. I just want to get the ticket and go home to my family." That frustration was the spark that lit Blake's fuse. In his mind, Kevin was now being openly defiant and challenging his authority. Every instinct Blake had developed over years of police work, combined with his exhaustion and stress, told him that this situation was about to become dangerous. Blake made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. Without warning, Blake grabbed Kevin by the shoulders and spun him around violently. Kevin, caught completely off guard, stumbled backward. His military training had prepared him for many things, but not for being attacked by the very people he'd sworn to protect. "You think you can give me attitude?" Blake shouted as he grabbed Kevin more aggressively. Kevin tried to regain his balance, but Blake was pushing him backward toward the rear of the truck. Kevin's hands came up instinctively, not to fight but to try to steady himself and protect his head. But Blake saw those raised hands as aggressive posturing. "Keep your hands down," Blake yelled. Even though Kevin's hands were only up for self-protection, what happened next would be burned into both men's memories forever. Blake, acting on adrenaline and poor judgment, grabbed Kevin and threw him to the ground with unnecessary force. Kevin, still trying to understand what was happening, hit the asphalt hard. The impact knocked the wind out of Kevin's lungs and scraped the skin off his arms and face. His head hit the pavement with a sickening thud that even Blake could hear clearly. For a moment, Kevin lay there stunned, trying to process what had just happened to him. Cars were driving by on the highway, and several people in passing vehicles had their phones out, recording what they were witnessing. The scene looked exactly like what it was: a police officer using excessive force on a person who posed no threat. Blake, his adrenaline pumping and his judgment completely clouded, wasn't finished. As Kevin tried to push himself up from the ground, Blake pulled out his taser. "Stay down," Blake commanded, pointing the weapon at Kevin. Kevin, dazed from hitting his head on the pavement, looked up at the officer with complete confusion and disbelief. Blood was trickling from a cut on his forehead, and his uniform was torn and dirty from the fall. "Please," Kevin said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a soldier. I served 3 tours overseas. I just want to go home." But Blake was beyond hearing anything Kevin had to say. The situation had escalated to a point where Blake felt he needed to maintain control at any cost. When Kevin made a small movement to try to sit up, Blake made another terrible decision. He fired the taser. The electrical shock coursed through Kevin's body, causing him to convulse and cry out in pain. Kevin had been shot at, had explosions go off near him, and had endured countless dangers during his military service. But this pain was different. It came from his own country, from people who were supposed to be on his side. As the taser's effects wore off, Kevin lay on the ground, no longer trying to move. He wasn't resisting because his military training had taught him never to fight against law enforcement, even when they were wrong. He believed in the system, believed in doing the right thing even when others weren't. Blake stood over Kevin, breathing heavily, his hand still on his weapon. The sight of the soldier lying on the ground, beaten and tased for no legitimate reason, should have brought Blake back to his senses. Instead, he felt a sick sense of satisfaction that he had controlled the situation. Kevin's wallet had fallen open during the struggle, and its contents were scattered across the asphalt. Military ID cards, photos of Kevin with his unit overseas, and something else that had fallen face up where Blake could see it clearly for the first time. It was a card indicating that Kevin was a recipient of the Bronze Star Medal, one of the military's highest honors for heroic achievement. Blake stared at it for a long moment, not fully processing what he was seeing. Several motorists had pulled over now, having witnessed what appeared to be a clear case of police brutality. One woman was on her phone with 911 reporting what she had seen. Others were still recording, capturing every moment of what had just transpired. Kevin lay on the ground staring up at the darkening sky, wondering how his homecoming had turned into this nightmare. He thought about his wife, who was probably still trying to call him. He thought about his children, who were expecting their daddy to come home soon. And he thought about all the times he'd risked his life overseas, only to be brutalized on American soil by someone wearing a badge. Blake looked down at the man he had just attacked and, for the first time since the traffic stop began, really saw what was in front of him. Kevin's uniform, which Blake had somehow failed to properly notice before, was clearly military. The patches and insignia told a story of service and sacrifice that Blake had completely ignored. But the realization of what he had done was just beginning to dawn on Officer Thompson. The full weight of his actions and their consequences would soon come crashing down on him in ways he never could have imagined. The emergency room at County General Hospital was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening when Kevin arrived by ambulance. The paramedics had insisted on transport after finding signs of a possible concussion, and Kevin had finally agreed, realizing that his family would worry more if he came home seriously injured than if he was a few hours late. Dr. Patricia Wong was the attending physician who first examined Kevin. She'd seen plenty of assault victims over her 12 years in emergency medicine, but there was something different about this patient. Despite his obvious injuries and the circumstances that brought him in, Kevin was polite, cooperative, and seemed more concerned about inconveniencing the staff than about his own condition. "Sergeant Martinez, can you tell me what happened?" Dr. Wong asked as she examined the gash on Kevin's forehead. Kevin hesitated for a moment. He'd been raised to respect authority and avoid causing trouble. Even after what had happened, his first instinct was to downplay the situation. "I was pulled over for speeding, and things got out of hand," Kevin said simply. Dr. Wong noted the way Kevin phrased his response. Most assault victims would describe what their attacker had done to them. Kevin was describing it as if it were somehow a mutual misunderstanding. "The police report says you were tased and thrown to the ground during a traffic stop," Dr. Wong said gently. "That's not getting out of hand, that's assault." The word hit Kevin hard. He'd been trying not to think of it that way, trying to give Officer Thompson the benefit of the doubt. But hearing a medical professional state, it so clearly made it impossible to deny. While Kevin was being treated, the consequences of Blake's actions were already beginning to ripple outward. The videos recorded by bystanders were being uploaded to social media, where they spread with frightening speed. Within 2 hours of the incident, the hashtag #JusticeForSoldier was trending locally. Captain Robert Hayes received the call at home just as he was sitting down to dinner with his family. When he heard the basic details of what had happened, he immediately got in his car and drove to the hospital. As a 28-year veteran of the police force, Hayes had seen officers make mistakes before. But this was different. Hayes arrived at the hospital to find Kevin in the examination room, getting stitches in his forehead. The sight of the injured soldier in his torn uniform made Hayes feel physically sick. This was exactly the kind of incident that destroyed public trust and made every officer's job harder. "Sergeant Martinez," Hayes said as he entered the room, "I'm Captain Hayes. I want to personally apologize for what happened to you today." Kevin looked up at the captain, surprised by the genuine remorse in his voice. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming here." Hayes pulled up a chair and sat down, something that surprised both Kevin and Dr. Wong. Police captains didn't usually sit down with assault victims for personal conversations. "Sergeant, I need you to know that what Officer Thompson did was completely unacceptable and against everything we stand for," Hayes said. "You deserve better from us, and I'm going to make sure this is investigated thoroughly." While this conversation was taking place, Blake was back at the police station, sitting in Captain Hayes' office with the door closed. He'd been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Blake sat alone, staring at the wall, replaying the events over and over in his mind. The body camera footage had already been reviewed by the department's Internal Affairs Division. The video showed everything: Kevin being completely cooperative, Blake escalating the situation unnecessarily, and the final violent confrontation that left a decorated soldier injured on the side of the road. Detective Karen Foster, a 20-year veteran who specialized in internal investigations, watched the footage with growing disbelief. She'd seen officers make poor decisions under stress before, but this was beyond anything she could justify or explain away. "There's no way to spin this," she said to her partner as they reviewed the evidence. "This is going to be a criminal case, not just administrative discipline." Back at the hospital, Kevin's wife Rachel had arrived after driving 2 hours from their home. She burst into the examination room just as Dr. Wong was finishing Kevin's stitches, and the sight of her husband's injuries brought tears to her eyes. "Oh my God, Kevin, what did they do to you?" Rachel cried as she rushed to his side. Kevin tried to comfort his wife even though he was the one who had been hurt. "I'm okay, honey. It looks worse than it is. The important thing is I'm home." Rachel wasn't buying it. She could see the pain in her husband's eyes, and not just physical pain. There was something broken in his expression that she'd never seen before, not even when he'd returned from his most difficult deployment. Dr. Wong observed the interaction between Kevin and his wife with professional interest. She'd treated many trauma victims, and she recognized the signs of someone trying to protect their loved ones from the truth of what they'd experienced. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Wong said gently, "your husband has a concussion, several lacerations, and what appears to be a dislocated shoulder. He's going to need to stay here overnight for observation." "Overnight?" Kevin protested. "Doctor, I just want to go home to my kids. I haven't seen them in 18 months. The longing in Kevin's voice broke Rachel's heart. She knew how much Kevin had been looking forward to surprising their children, how he'd planned every detail of his homecoming during their phone calls overseas. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading beyond social media. Local news stations had picked up the story, and reporters were already gathering outside the police station. The department's public information officer was fielding calls from news outlets across the state. The video footage was devastating from a public relations standpoint. It showed a clear case of excessive force against a person who posed no threat. But the fact that the victim was a decorated soldier made the story even more compelling to media outlets. By 10 p.m., less than 4 hours after the incident, it was the lead story on every local news broadcast. The anchor on Channel 7 News introduced the story with barely contained outrage. "Tonight, we have disturbing video of a local police officer attacking an Army sergeant during what should have been a routine traffic stop. The soldier, who just returned from his 3rd combat tour overseas, was left bloodied and injured on the side of the highway." The footage played on television screens across the city, showing Blake throwing Kevin to the ground and then tasing him. Viewers could see Kevin's military uniform clearly, could see his obvious confusion and compliance, could see that he posed no threat whatsoever. Public reaction was swift and furious. The police department's phone lines were flooded with angry calls. Social media was exploding with outrage. Veterans organizations were already preparing statements condemning the attack. Back at the hospital, Captain Hayes was having a difficult conversation with Kevin and Rachel about what would happen next. "There will be a full criminal investigation," Hayes explained. "Officer Thompson will likely face charges. We're also conducting our own internal investigation, but I want to be clear, this won't be swept under the rug." Kevin listened to the captain's words, but part of him was still struggling to believe this was really happening. He'd always believed in the system, always trusted that law enforcement officers were the good guys. Having that faith shattered was almost more painful than his physical injuries. "Captain," Kevin said quietly, "I just want to understand why this happened. I was respectful. I followed orders. I've never been in trouble with the law in my life. I served my country with honor. Why did he treat me like a criminal?" Hayes didn't have a good answer to that question. He'd been asking himself the same thing since he'd first heard about the incident. There was no justification for Blake's actions, no reasonable explanation that would make sense to anyone. "I don't know, Sergeant," Hayes said honestly. I wish I had a better answer for you. All I can tell you is that what happened was wrong, and we're going to make sure there are consequences. As the night wore on, the full scope of the consequences was beginning to become clear. This wasn't going to be a local story that disappeared after a day or two. This was going to be national news, a symbol of everything that was wrong with police accountability and treatment of veterans. Blake, sitting alone in his apartment after being sent home on administrative leave, was starting to understand the magnitude of what he had done. His phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, from friends, from family members who had seen the news. He ignored them all, staring at the wall and wondering how his life had fallen apart so completely in just a few hours. The soldier he had attacked was a hero. The man Blake had treated like a dangerous criminal had risked his life repeatedly to protect the freedoms that Blake himself enjoyed. And now that hero was lying in a hospital bed because of Blake's inexcusable actions. For the first time since the incident, Blake began to cry. 2 weeks after the incident, Blake sat in his empty apartment staring at a letter he had written and rewritten dozens of times. It was an apology letter to Kevin, but every version felt inadequate. How do you apologize for destroying someone's homecoming? How do you say sorry for attacking a hero? How do you explain actions that you can't even understand yourself? Blake's world had completely collapsed. His wife had filed for divorce and moved out with their children. His father still wouldn't speak to him. He'd been terminated from the police force, charged with multiple crimes, and faced a civil lawsuit that would likely leave him financially ruined for the rest of his life. But worse than all of that was the crushing weight of guilt that followed him every waking moment. Blake had always prided himself on being a protector, someone who stood between good people and those who would harm them. Now he was the one people needed protection from. The letter in his hands was his 15th attempt at an apology. Each previous version had ended up crumpled in the trash because Blake realized that any attempt to explain his actions sounded like he was making excuses. There were no excuses for what he had done. Finally, Blake wrote something simple and honest. Sergeant Martinez, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing this letter to ask for it. I'm writing because you deserve to hear me say that what I did was completely wrong, inexcusable, and contrary to everything I once believed I stood for. You served our country with honor and heroism, and I repaid that service by attacking you for no reason. I am deeply ashamed of my actions and will regret them for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to respond to this letter or to ever want to see me again. I just wanted you to know that I understand the magnitude of what I did, and I am truly sorry. Blake Thompson. Blake sealed the letter and drove to the hospital where Kevin had been treated, hoping to leave it at the nurse's station. But when he arrived, he was told that Kevin had specifically requested that Blake not be allowed to contact him or visit the hospital. The rejection stung, but Blake understood it completely. Kevin had every right to want nothing to do with the person who had attacked him. Blake drove home, the unopened letter still in his hand, feeling more hopeless than ever. Meanwhile, Kevin was struggling with his own demons. The physical injuries were healing, but the psychological impact was proving more difficult to overcome. He found himself unable to trust police officers, flinching whenever he saw a patrol car, and experiencing panic attacks during routine activities. Rachel was doing her best to support her husband, but she was also dealing with her own trauma. Watching the video of Kevin being attacked had been almost as devastating for her as experiencing it had been for him. She kept thinking about how close she had come to losing her husband, not to enemy fire overseas, but to police brutality at home. I keep having dreams about it, Kevin told Rachel one evening as they sat on their couch. But in the dreams I fight back. I use my training to defend myself, and then I wake up feeling guilty because part of me wishes I had. Rachel took her husband's hand. You did the right thing by not fighting back. If you had, they would have said you were the aggressor. They would have made you the villain. Kevin knew his wife was right, but it didn't make the feelings go away. His military training had prepared him to respond to threats with overwhelming force when necessary, but his values and respect for law enforcement had prevented him from protecting himself. The conflict between those two instincts was tearing him apart. Dr. Patricia Wong, the emergency room physician who had treated Kevin, had recommended that he see a therapist who specialized in trauma. Kevin was resistant at first. He'd made it through 3 combat tours without needing therapy, and admitting he needed help now felt like weakness. But Rachel eventually convinced him to try, and Kevin found himself sitting in Dr. Amanda Foster's office, trying to explain how being attacked by a police officer had affected him more than years of combat. "It's different when the threat comes from someone who's supposed to be on your side," Dr. Foster explained. "In combat, you expect danger from the enemy. But when you're attacked by someone wearing a badge, someone who represents the country you fought to protect, it shakes your faith in the very system you believed in." As Kevin was beginning therapy, Blake was also seeking professional help, not because he wanted to, but because his lawyer had insisted that demonstrating remorse and a commitment to change might help during sentencing. Blake's therapist, Dr. Robert Chen, specialized in anger management and police trauma. During their first session, Blake was defensive and unwilling to take full responsibility for his actions. "I was having a bad day," Blake said. "I'd dealt with several difficult calls and I was stressed out. The situation just escalated beyond what I expected." Dr. Chen stopped him immediately. "Mr. Thompson, if you're here to blame your actions on stress or bad days, we're going to waste a lot of time. Millions of people have bad days without attacking innocent veterans. We need to dig deeper than that." Over the following weeks, Dr. Chen helped Blake begin to understand the psychological factors that had led to his violent outburst. Years of unaddressed stress, a tendency to see threats where none existed, and an inability to admit when he was wrong had all contributed to the incident. But understanding the psychological factors didn't excuse Blake's actions, and Dr. Chen made that clear repeatedly. "Understanding why you did something doesn't make it acceptable," he explained. "It just gives you tools to make sure it never happens again." As Blake worked with his therapist, he began to research Kevin's military service more thoroughly. He read about Kevin's Bronze Star action, where he had single-handedly held off enemy fighters to protect his unit. He learned about the Purple Heart incident, where Kevin had been injured by an IED while on patrol. He discovered that Kevin had volunteered for multiple dangerous missions and had saved the lives of several fellow soldiers. The more Blake learned about Kevin's heroism, the more disgusted he became with himself. He had attacked someone who embodied everything that was good about service and sacrifice. Kevin had risked his life repeatedly to protect others, while Blake had used his position of authority to harm an innocent person. Blake's research led him to reach out to other veterans, trying to understand the impact of his actions on the broader military community. What he learned was devastating. Veterans who had seen the video felt betrayed and unsafe. Many reported that the incident had made them fearful of interactions with law enforcement. "You didn't just attack one soldier," a Marine veteran told Blake during a phone conversation. "You attacked all of us. You made us all feel less safe in our own country." The weight of that responsibility was crushing. Blake had always thought of his actions as affecting only Kevin, but he was beginning to understand that the ripple effects extended far beyond one person. Blake made a decision that surprised everyone, including his lawyer. He decided to plead guilty to all charges without seeking a plea deal. He wanted to take full responsibility for his actions, regardless of the consequences. "I don't want to drag this out in court," Blake told his attorney. "I don't want to put Sergeant Martinez through the trauma of testifying. I did what I'm accused of, and I deserve whatever punishment the judge decides." His lawyer was strongly against this decision, warning Blake that he could face significant prison time without a plea agreement. But Blake was determined. For the first time since the incident, he was going to do the right thing, even if it cost him everything. The news of Blake's decision to plead guilty made headlines, but it also marked the beginning of what some saw as a path toward redemption. Blake had stopped making excuses and started taking responsibility. It was a small first step, but it was genuine. Kevin, when he heard about Blake's guilty plea, felt a mix of emotions. Part of him was satisfied that Blake was taking responsibility, but another part of him still struggled with anger and hurt. Justice in the legal system was one thing, but healing from the trauma was going to take much longer. As both men continued their separate journeys of recovery and redemption, neither knew that their paths would eventually cross again in a way that would surprise everyone involved. 6 months after the incident, Blake stood before Judge Catherine Mills for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with reporters, veterans, police officers, and community members who had followed the case closely. Blake had pleaded guilty to all charges and now faced the consequences of his actions. Kevin was also present, having decided at the last moment that he wanted to give a victim impact statement. For months, he had avoided any direct contact with Blake or the legal proceedings, focusing instead on his own healing. But as the case neared its conclusion, Kevin felt he needed to speak his piece. When Kevin took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. He wore his military dress uniform, his service ribbons and decorations clearly visible. The sight of the decorated soldier that Blake had attacked drove home the severity of the crime for everyone present. "Your Honor," Kevin began, his voice steady but emotional, "6 months ago, I was driving home from my 3rd deployment overseas. I was excited to surprise my family, to finally be back in the country I had served and protected. Instead, I found myself being attacked by someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community." Kevin paused, looking directly at Blake for the first time since the incident. "I want you to know that what you did to me changed my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. You didn't just hurt me physically, though the concussion and injuries were serious. You damaged my faith in the system I fought to protect. You made me afraid in my own country." Blake listened with tears in his eyes, finally hearing directly from the man whose life he had damaged so badly. Kevin continued, "But I also want you to know that I don't hate you. Hate would only hurt me more, and I've been hurt enough. What I want is for you to understand that your actions have consequences that go far beyond this courtroom." Every veteran who saw that video felt less safe. Every military family wondered if their loved one could face the same treatment. The courtroom was completely quiet as Kevin delivered the most powerful part of his statement. "I served overseas to protect the freedoms and rights that you violated that day. I risked my life so that people could live safely in this country. You repaid that service by attacking me without cause. That's something you'll have to live with for the rest of your life." When Kevin finished speaking, Judge Mills called for a brief recess. Blake sat with his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the weight of Kevin's words. Hearing directly from his victim about the impact of his actions was more devastating than any news article or social media post had been. After the recess, Judge Mills delivered her sentence. Blake was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service specifically with veteran organizations, and mandatory anger management counseling. He was also ordered to pay restitution for Kevin's medical expenses and lost wages. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Mills said as she delivered the sentence, "you violated your oath as a police officer and your duty as a citizen when you attacked Sergeant Martinez. Your actions brought shame on law enforcement and caused immeasurable harm to a man who served his country with honor. This sentence reflects not just punishment, but an opportunity for you to make some small amends for what you did." After the hearing, Blake was led away in handcuffs to begin his prison sentence. As he was leaving the courtroom, he managed to catch Kevin's eye one more time. Blake mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," and Kevin, after a moment's hesitation, nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Blake's time in prison was difficult but transformative. He used the 18 months to continue therapy, to read extensively about veteran issues and police reform, and to correspond with other veterans who were willing to help him understand the impact of his actions. One of those veterans was Robert Martinez, an Army veteran who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Robert had initially contacted Blake to express his anger about the incident, but their correspondence had evolved into something more constructive. "If you really want to make amends," Robert wrote in one letter, "you need to do more than just serve your time. You need to dedicate your life to making sure this never happens to another veteran." That letter planted a seed in Blake's mind that would eventually grow into a life-changing decision. Meanwhile, Kevin was making progress in his own healing journey. The therapy was helping him process the trauma, and he had begun speaking at veteran events about his experience. His story had become a rallying point for police reform and veteran rights, though Kevin was still uncomfortable with the attention. During one speaking engagement at a veterans organization, Kevin met Dr. Lisa Thompson, a psychologist who worked with both veterans and law enforcement officers. Dr. Thompson had been following Kevin's case and had an unusual proposal. "I think there's an opportunity here for something powerful," she told Kevin after his speech. "I work with a program that brings together victims and offenders in cases where both parties are willing. It's called restorative justice, and it focuses on healing rather than just punishment." Kevin was initially skeptical. He had no desire to see Blake again or to help him feel better about what he had done. But Dr. Thompson explained that restorative justice wasn't about forgiveness or absolution. It was about understanding and healing for everyone involved. After discussing it with Rachel and his therapist, Kevin agreed to consider a meeting with Blake after he was released from prison. The meeting would be carefully facilitated and completely voluntary for both parties. When Blake was released from prison after serving his full sentence, he had changed dramatically. The arrogant, defensive officer who had attacked Kevin was gone, replaced by someone who had spent 18 months confronting his own failures and prejudices. Blake's first priority after release was finding work and housing, both of which proved challenging with a criminal record. He eventually found a job at a non-profit organization that helped ex-offenders reintegrate into society, work that felt appropriate given his own situation. 3 months after his release, Blake received a call from Dr. Thompson, asking if he would be willing to meet with Kevin. Blake was surprised. He had assumed that Kevin would never want to see him again. "I don't know if I deserve that opportunity," Blake told Dr. Thompson, "but if Sergeant Martinez is willing, I would welcome the chance to apologize to him directly." The meeting took place in a neutral location, a conference room at the Veterans Organization where Kevin had been speaking. Both men were nervous as they sat down across from each other with Dr. Thompson facilitating. Kevin spoke first. "I agreed to this meeting because my therapist thought it might help with my healing. I want you to know that this isn't about forgiveness. I'm not ready for that, and I may never be. This is about me understanding why you did what you did, and you understanding how it affected me." Blake nodded, grateful for Kevin's honesty. "Sergeant Martinez, I've spent the last 2 years trying to understand my actions, and I still don't have a complete answer. What I do know is that I was wrong, completely and inexcusably wrong. I let stress and fear and poor judgment turn me into someone I never wanted to be." The conversation continued for over 2 hours. Kevin talked about the ongoing impact of the trauma, the way it had affected his family, and his struggle to rebuild his faith in the system he had served. Blake talked about his own journey of understanding, the therapy that had helped him recognize his problems, and his commitment to making amends. By the end of the meeting, neither man was ready to call the other a friend, but there was a mutual understanding that hadn't existed before. Kevin saw that Blake's remorse was genuine, and Blake fully grasped the devastating impact of his actions. That meeting led to an unlikely partnership. Kevin and Blake began working together on police training programs, sharing their story with law enforcement officers across the country. Kevin would talk about the impact of police misconduct on veterans and communities, while Blake would discuss the factors that led to his poor judgment and the importance of accountability. Their joint presentations were powerful and effective. Police officers who heard their story were forced to confront the real-world consequences of excessive force and poor decision-making. Veterans who attended felt heard and validated in their concerns about law enforcement. The work wasn't easy for either man. Kevin often struggled with anxiety before presentations, and Blake faced hostility from some audiences who saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with policing. But both men felt that their joint effort was making a difference. 2 years after the incident that brought them together in the worst possible way, Kevin and Blake stood before a group of new police recruits telling their story once again. Kevin talked about service and sacrifice, about coming home from war only to be attacked by the people sworn to protect him. Blake talked about accountability and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. After the presentation, a young recruit approached them with a question. "How do you two work together after what happened? How do you move past something like that?" Kevin and Blake looked at each other, a question they had been asked dozens of times. "We don't move past it," Kevin answered. "We learn from it. We make sure it never happens again." 3 days after the incident, Kevin was finally released from the hospital. The concussion had been more serious than initially thought, requiring extended observation and neurological testing. As he walked out of the hospital with Rachel by his side, he was greeted by a scene he never could have expected. Dozens of people had gathered outside County General, holding signs of support. Veterans from various wars, active military personnel on leave, and civilians who had been moved by his story all stood in a show of solidarity. Some held American flags, others had signs reading, Thank you for your service and justice for our heroes. Kevin stopped walking when he saw the crowd. After 3 days of isolation in a hospital room, the overwhelming show of support brought tears to his eyes. An elderly man in a Vietnam War veteran's cap approached him slowly. "Son," the older veteran said, extending his hand, "I served in Vietnam, and I want you to know that what happened to you was wrong. We've got your back." Kevin shook the man's hand, struggling to find words. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," the veteran replied. "You've already done enough for this country." Meanwhile, across town, Blake's life was falling apart in ways he never could have imagined. The video of the incident had gone viral nationally, making Blake one of the most hated police officers in America overnight. His face was plastered across news websites and social media platforms, accompanied by articles describing him as a rogue cop and veteran abuser. Blake's own family was struggling to cope with the aftermath. His wife Jennifer had taken their 2 young children to stay with her parents after reporters began showing up at their house. His elderly father, a Vietnam veteran himself, had called Blake once since the incident, only to tell him how ashamed and disappointed he was. "Dad served his country with honor," Blake's father had said during that painful phone call. "And you attacked someone who did the same thing. I don't understand how I raised a son who could do something like this." Those words cut deeper than any news headline or social media post could. Blake had always looked up to his father, had joined the police force partly because his dad had taught him to respect service and sacrifice. Now that same father couldn't bear to look at him. The police department was also dealing with intense scrutiny. Captain Hayes found himself fielding calls from reporters, politicians, and advocacy groups, all demanding answers and accountability. The department's reputation, built over decades of community policing efforts, was being destroyed by one officer's terrible decision. During a press conference, Captain Hayes announced that Blake would face criminal charges and had been terminated from the police force effective immediately. The termination was swift and decisive, with no possibility of reinstatement. "Officer Thompson's actions were completely contrary to our values and training," Captain Hayes told the assembled media. "They do not represent who we are as a department or what we stand for as law enforcement professionals." But the damage was already done. Protesters had gathered outside the police station for 3 consecutive days, demanding broader reforms and accountability measures. The incident had become a symbol of police overreach and the treatment of veterans by the very institutions they had sworn to protect. Kevin's story, meanwhile, was inspiring people across the country. His military service record had been made public, revealing details of his heroism that made Blake's attack even more shocking. During his 3 tours overseas, Kevin had saved the lives of multiple fellow soldiers, had volunteered for dangerous missions, and had been wounded twice in the line of duty. The Bronze Star citation told the story of how Kevin had single-handedly held off enemy fighters while calling in air support to protect his unit. His Purple Heart had been earned when he'd been injured by an improvised explosive device while on patrol. These weren't just decorations. They represented real sacrifices and genuine heroism. National veterans organizations had taken up Kevin's cause. The Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a statement calling for justice and reform. The American Legion organized support rallies in multiple cities. Military families who had never heard of Kevin before felt a personal connection to his story. "This could have been any of our sons or daughters coming home from deployment," said Maria Santos, whose own son had served in Afghanistan. "These heroes deserve better from us." Blake, meanwhile, was discovering that being infamous was very different from being famous. He couldn't leave his apartment without being recognized and confronted by angry strangers. His social media accounts had been deleted after receiving thousands of death threats. Former colleagues from the police department were avoiding him, unwilling to be associated with his actions. The legal consequences were mounting as well. Blake had been charged with assault, battery, excessive use of force, and civil rights violations. His lawyer, appointed by the police union, had advised him that a plea deal might be his best option, given the overwhelming evidence against him. But beyond the legal and professional consequences, Blake was dealing with something much deeper: the knowledge that he had betrayed everything he had once claimed to believe in. He had joined the police force to help people, to serve his community, to make a difference. Instead, he had attacked an innocent man who embodied everything Blake should have respected. The psychological weight of his actions was crushing. Blake had always seen himself as one of the good guys, someone who protected others from harm. Now he was the person others needed protection from. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, leading to sleepless nights and a depression that seemed to grow deeper each day. Kevin's homecoming, which should have been a celebration, had been permanently tainted by the incident. His children, ages 8 and 10, couldn't understand why their father was on television or why strangers were angry at a police officer. Kevin and Rachel struggled to explain the situation without destroying their children's faith in law enforcement and authority figures. "Daddy, are all police officers bad?" his 8-year-old daughter asked one evening as they watched the news. Kevin thought carefully before answering. Despite everything that had happened to him, he didn't want his children to grow up fearing or hating law enforcement. "No, sweetheart," Kevin said gently. "Most police officers are good people who want to help others. Sometimes, though, people make very bad mistakes. What happened to Daddy was a mistake, a very serious one." The incident was also taking a toll on Kevin's mental health in ways that weren't immediately visible. He was experiencing nightmares, sudden anxiety attacks, and a hypervigilance that made simple activities like going to the grocery store feel threatening. The attack had triggered symptoms that his 3 combat tours hadn't caused. Rachel noticed the changes in her husband immediately. Kevin, who had always been calm and steady, was now jumpy and anxious. He checked locks multiple times before bed, insisted on sitting with his back to the wall in restaurants, and flinched whenever he heard sirens. "This is different from when you came back from overseas," Rachel observed during a quiet moment. "The war didn't break you, but this did something." Kevin nodded, understanding exactly what his wife meant. In combat, he had known who his enemies were and why they were fighting. The rules of engagement were clear, even in chaotic situations. But being attacked by someone who was supposed to protect him in his own country had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. The media attention, while supportive, was also overwhelming. Kevin found himself becoming a reluctant symbol for veteran rights and police reform. Interview requests poured in from major news networks, magazines, and podcasts. Everyone wanted to tell his story, but Kevin wasn't sure he was ready to relive the trauma over and over again for public consumption. As the first week after the incident drew to a close, both Kevin and Blake were learning that some moments change everything. Neither man's life would ever be the same again. One had become an unwilling hero and symbol, while the other had become a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the consequences of unchecked aggression. The ripple effects of those few minutes on Highway 75 would continue to spread, touching the lives of people neither man had ever met and sparking conversations about justice, accountability, and the treatment of those who serve their country.